The desert doesn't kill you all at once. It starts with the light. By mid-morning, the air above the sand begins to ripple, not like water, but like something being torn apart very slowly, layer by layer, until the horizon dissolves into a pale smear and you can no longer trust your own eyes. Distances collapse. A dune 200 meters away looks like it's 50. A man standing still looks like he's moving. A shadow that should be there isn't. Then the heat comes for your body. Not warmth, not even heat in the way you'd normally describe it. It's pressure, a vast, indifferent weight pressing down from above and radiating up from the ground at the same time, so that you're being cooked from both directions at once. Your uniform stops being clothing and becomes a second skin that burns. Your throat dries so completely that swallowing hurts. Your eyes ache behind the lids. Your brain slows, becomes thick with it, makes decisions in the way a machine makes decisions when it's running too hot, technically, but not well. Then the light comes for your perception. This is the part nobody warns you about adequately. By the time the temperature reaches 45 degrees Celsius and above, the air itself becomes an unreliable medium. Light bends surfaces that should be distinct smear into their surroundings. The hard, clear geometry of walls and ridgelines and elevated terrain, the geometry that tactical thinking depends on, the geometry that tells you where you are and where the threat is, and how the ground lies between those 2 points softens at the edges and becomes arguable. In a desert environment in high summer, your eyes will report things to your brain that are not true, not because you're hallucinating, because the physics of light and superheated air genuinely do what they do, and what they do is lie to you with complete consistency. And then, underneath all of that, comes the quiet. The desert is the quietest place on Earth when it wants to be. No wind, no insects, no ambient mechanical hum from a civilization 1,000 miles away. Just the faint creak of your own gear, the sound of your own breathing amplified by the silence around it, and the steady, awful awareness that somewhere out there, somewhere you cannot see, cannot locate, cannot triangulate, something is watching you. 6 men. A crumbled compound wall. 40 meters of open ground on 3 sides, and 1-shot radio. The mission had gone wrong in stages, the way missions always do, not in one catastrophic moment, but in a sequence of small failures that accumulated until suddenly, you looked up and realized the situation had become something entirely different from what you'd planned for. The extraction window had missed. The backup channel was static. And then Sergeant Dale Harwick had taken a round through the shoulder before any of them heard a shot. That was the first one. The second came 12 minutes later. Corporal James Pruitt, crouched low behind a shattered doorframe, rifle up, scanning the ridge 400 meters northwest. A small red mist where his neck had been. He sat down slowly, like a man deciding to rest, and didn't get back up. No sound, no report, no visible flash from the ridge, no traceable trajectory in the sand. Staff Sergeant Owen Burkett pressed himself against the interior wall of the compound and tried to breathe. 5 men now. The radio was dead except for static on 2 frequencies and a thin, intermittent carrier wave on a third that hadn't resolved into anything coherent. His team leader, Master Sergeant Garrett Cole, was crouched 3 feet away, not moving, not speaking, doing the math that Burkett was also doing. In a firefight, noise gives you information, direction, distance, rhythm of fire. You can map a shooter by sound alone if you're experienced enough, but there was no noise here. Pruitt's death had been preceded by nothing and followed by nothing. No echo, no percussion. No after-ring of a suppressed shot bouncing off hard surfaces. Just the desert, just the sun, just the quiet that kept getting heavier. Where's it coming from? Private First Class Derek Moss whispered. He was 23 years old and had been in country for 11 months, and he had never in his career felt fear quite like this. Not the clean, clarifying fear of a direct firefight, but something older and slower, the kind that sits in the stomach and doesn't move. We don't know, Cole said. Northwest Ridge. Pruitt was watching the Northwest Ridge. He was down before he fired. Cole didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The implications settled over the group like another layer of heat. A conventional sniper, even an excellent one, leaves evidence. Muzzle flash. Sound signature with a predictable delay based on distance. Bullet entry angle that can be backtraced to a firing position. Given enough time and information, you can find them. That's the foundation of counter-sniper doctrine. The shooter gives something away every time they shoot, and you accumulate data until the position resolves. But Harwick had been hit from an angle that didn't match the only elevated terrain in sight. Pruitt had been watching the most obvious firing position and had still died from it or from somewhere else entirely. The geometry was impossible to read, and in both cases, the silence had been total. Corporal Nathaniel Voss, the team's communications specialist, had spent the last 40 minutes cycling through every frequency on the backup radio and getting nothing. The primary was physically destroyed. A round had punched through the housing during the initial contact, which meant either the shooter had deliberately targeted communications equipment first, or they had gotten extraordinarily lucky. Voss didn't believe in luck anymore. Not after today. They're playing with us, said Sergeant Marcus Leland. His voice was flat and deliberate in the way voices get when the owner is suppressing something large. They could have taken more of us already. They didn't. They're letting us sit here. Don't. Burkett started. I'm not panicking. I'm observing. 2 shots in 40 minutes. 2 specific shots. They hit Harwick first, non-fatal, keeps him alive, pins us while we deal with him. Then Pruitt, the one who was actively trying to locate the shooter. They took out our eyes. Leland looked at Cole. That's not random. That's methodology. Cole was quiet, because Leland was right. The sun climbed. The temperature rose. Harwick had stopped making noise, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. The bandaging had held, or the shock had gotten him. Voss kept working the radio with the single-minded focus of a man who has decided that the radio is the only problem he's willing to acknowledge. And then, just after 1400 hours, the third shot came. Corporal Brian Fenwick had moved 6 inches, just 6 inches, to get a better angle on the eastern approach because he thought they'd all thought that maybe the shooter had repositioned and was now east. 6 inches of lateral movement, very slow, very controlled. The round hit the wall 3 centimeters above his head. Fenwick flattened himself and didn't move again. His breathing was audible across the whole compound. They missed, Moss said. No, Cole said quietly. They didn't. The carrier wave resolved at 1,427. Not into words at first, just a change in quality. A subtle shift from pure static to something that had rhythm beneath it. A modulation that suggested intention. Voss pressed the receiver harder against his ear and adjusted the squelch control by increments too small to see. And then, clearly, with a flatness that somehow cut right through the ambient noise of everything. Don't move. 2 words. Female voice. No accent he could place. No inflection beyond the pure functional weight of the words themselves. Voss stared at the radio for a long moment. Then he looked at Cole. Say again, Cole said into the handset. Silence. 8, 9, 10 seconds. The static breathed. You have a shooter on your northwest at 1100 meters. There's a second one you haven't found. Do not move until I tell you. Identify yourself, Cole said. Nothing. Whoever this is, identify yourself and your unit. We need 11 o'clock. The ridge you're watching isn't the ridge. Don't move. Moss's jaw tightened. It's a trap. They're redirecting us so their guy can reposition. Our guy already repositioned, Leland said. That's how Pruitt died. If this was misdirection, it would have pointed us toward where we were already looking. The silence on the radio stretched. 60 seconds. 90. Fenwick, who had not moved since the round hit 3 centimeters above his head, spoke without turning his head. I want to hear what else she says. We don't know who she is. We don't know who's shooting at us either. At least she hasn't hit anyone yet. Nobody had a response to that. Moss broke first. He didn't mean to. It was a muscle response. 3 hours of cramped position producing an involuntary shift in his weight. A slight rise on his left knee as he redistributed his center of gravity. The movement was small, barely perceptible. The round hit Moss's rifle scope and destroyed it without touching him. The impact spun the weapon out of his hands and he sat back hard, unhurt, staring at the shattered optic, his hands shaking and his face entirely white. The radio. I said don't move. Next one, I can't promise. Who are you? Cole asked. His voice had changed. The command authority was still there, but underneath it now was something that hadn't been there before, a quality of genuine, unguarded uncertainty. The pause was different this time. Shorter. Call sign, pale echo. I'm going to move you out of there. But you do exactly what I say, when I say it, in the order I say it, nothing before, nothing after. If I say stop, you stop in place. If I say down, you're flat before you finish hearing the word. Are we clear? We have a man with a shoulder wound who can't run. I know. He goes second to last. I'll cover the gap. How do you? I've been watching you for 2 hours. I know what you have and what you don't. Get ready to move in 3 minutes. Cole looked at his team. He looked at Harwick, who was conscious again, pale and sweating, jaw set against the pain. He looked at the shattered scope on Moss's rifle. He looked at the walls of the compound that had stopped being protection an hour ago and had simply become a slower version of a trap. He keyed the radio. 3 minutes. What's your position? Irrelevant. Get your people ready. In the following 3 minutes, Owen Burkett experienced a kind of mental recalibration he would spend years trying to describe afterward without fully succeeding. Because what Pale Echo did in those 3 minutes before anyone moved, before the exfiltration began, was begin to narrate a situation they were inside but could not see. The second shooter is 480 meters, bearing 035, prone on reverse slope. He's been there since before you arrived. He hasn't fired because he's reserve. He triggers when the primary decides you're running. The primary is at 990 meters. Not 1100, I corrected. He's been moving every 22 to 25 minutes, which is why your geometry hasn't resolved. He moved 16 minutes ago. He has 4 to 8 minutes before he moves again. There's a low route behind your east wall, running south for approximately 200 meters before it turns. It's in dead ground relative to both positions for the first 140 meters. After that, you're exposed for a window of about 8 seconds. I'll handle the window. Your job is not to stop moving. Voss was writing it down. Not because he doubted his memory, but because the act of writing made it more real. 2 minutes. Get your wounded man between 2 people who can carry weight. They went on her word. Move. Cole went first, then Fenwick, then Voss, then Harwick, supported between Leland and Burkett. moving in a low broken shuffle that was less dignified than any of them would have liked and entirely necessary. Moss went last, rifle still functional even with the scope destroyed, covering the rear, because covering the rear was what he was trained to do even when he had no idea what he was covering it from or in what direction the next threat would arrive. The dead ground was exactly where she said it was. The low route ran between two crumbled walls with sand heaped high on either side, channeled by some ancient drainage pattern that had nothing to do with tactical thinking and everything to do with physics. They moved through it in a hunched run, not speaking, the only sounds their boots on packed sand and Harwick's involuntary sounds of pain that Leland was quietly absorbing by holding him tighter. At 90 meters, the radio, slow to walking pace, don't stop. They slowed. At 120 meters, in 10 seconds, the route opens. You will be exposed. Keep moving. Do not look toward the ridge. Eyes forward. Don't stop. Burkett counted. 1, 2, 3. His back felt like a window, like a target, like something that would resolve any second into a hard impact and sudden loss of everything after it. 4, 5. He could feel the sun on his left cheek and know that meant west was left, and the ridge was generally northwest and he had to look north and not northwest and keep. 6, 7. The shot, when it came, didn't come for any of them. It came from very far away and very far in a different direction. A single flat percussion that the heat distorted into something almost abstract. And it was followed immediately by silence. A different silence from the ambient silence of the desert, the silence of something that had been operating and had now stopped. Keep moving. You're clear on primary. Secondary is holding. 30 more seconds. 30 seconds. They moved. Burkett counted them in his head. At 28, the route turned south as promised, and then the walls rose on either side again and the dead ground returned and the pressure between his shoulder blades finally, incrementally, eased. Stop at the next break in the west wall. There's a vehicle 200 meters south. Keys are in it. How do you know theirs? Because I put them there. Keep moving. The vehicle was a battered Land Cruiser with a cracked windshield and no markings, and the keys were exactly where she said they would be, clipped to the driver's side sun visor with a binder clip. Cole drove. Nobody spoke for the first 10 minutes. Harwick was in the back between Leland and Burkett, his shoulder properly wrapped now with materials from Voss's kit. His color was bad but his eyes were tracking and his pulse was strong enough. He'd be fine. He'd been fine since an hour into the contact. Actually, the wound was clean. The round had passed through. But they hadn't known that during the worst of it, which had been part of the wait. Nobody spoke for the first 12 minutes. There was a quality to the silence that was different from the silence of the desert they'd just left. This was the silence of people who had been compressed to their smallest possible selves by fear and had not yet fully re-expanded. Cole drove steadily. The road, such as it was, unspooled ahead of them in the afternoon glare, packed earth and occasional gravel and, in the distance, the first suggestion of a smeared brown horizon that might be a town or might be heat playing tricks. Harwick slept, or appeared to. His breathing had leveled out, and his color had improved marginally, and the bandaging had held. Burkett kept a hand on his pulse at the wrist without quite deciding to a reflex, checking and rechecking the steady beat of a thing that was still there. At the 12-minute mark, Moss said, "Who is she?" Nobody answered. She knew where the vehicle was. She put it there. She was watching us for 2 hours before she came on the radio. She knew about the second shooter before any of us. We know, Cole said. That's not a coincidence of position. That's preparation. She was there before we were there, which means she either knew we were coming, or she's been watching that compound for a reason that has nothing to do with us. Fenwick, who had been staring out the window at the sand moving past, said, "Cold bore shot." What? The first shot she took. The one that cleared primary. That's a cold bore shot first round from a barrel that hasn't been warmed by previous fire. At that range, he paused. You know what the margin for error is on a cold bore shot past 900 meters in that heat, with that wind? Nobody answered that either, because the answer was essentially, there shouldn't be one. There was too much variable, too much thermal distortion, too many micro-corrections that needed to happen in the barrel itself as the metal heated and shifted. A competent sniper mitigates it by firing a warm-up round first, sacrificing concealment for mechanical consistency. A truly cold bore shot at extreme range, in those conditions, with those crosswinds, it wasn't something you calculated your way through. It was something you felt, and either you had the capacity to feel it accurately or you didn't, and almost no one did. Fenwick kept looking out the window. There's a correction protocol for cold bore. You establish it with your specific weapon, your specific ammunition, over multiple sessions. You document it. You apply it as a fixed offset. It works within a narrow range of environmental conditions. He paused. Today's conditions were not within that range, not even close. The correction she'd have had from prior sessions would have been wrong by a margin that gets a man killed at that distance. So she adjusted on the fly. Adjusted isn't the word. He turned from the window. His expression was the expression of someone who has encountered something their framework doesn't account for and is being honest about that fact. She solved it. In real time, in conditions that made the math genuinely hard, and then she hit a target at 900 plus meters. First round, clean. while we were moving and she was managing the geometry of 2 active shooters simultaneously. He went back to the window. I don't know what to call that. The vehicle moved through the desert. The light was shifting, the long afternoon shadows beginning to lean east, the brutal overhead pressure of midday softening incrementally into something almost bearable. She told Moss not to move, Burkett said. Yeah. And then when he moved, she didn't take his scope out because she was punishing him. She did it because if she'd let him take that movement, the primary would have engaged. She was buying us time. She managed the whole board, both shooters, our movement, our speed, the timing of her shot. He stopped, from a position she never told us about, that none of us saw. The desert slid past the windows. At the 40-minute mark, Voss tried the radio again. Got static. The debrief lasted 6 hours and produced a formal report that was, in Cole's assessment, an almost entirely accurate account of what had happened, and a completely inadequate account of what it had felt like, which was probably appropriate. Feelings weren't operational data. The room was standard fluorescent lights, a table with a kind of surface that showed every ring from every coffee cup that had ever sat on it, chairs that were technically ergonomic and practically weren't. There was a recorder, a legal pad, 2 people on the other side of the table, and the particular institutional quality of attention that belongs to people who are trained to listen for not just what you say but the shape of how you say it. Cole had done debriefs before. He understood the protocol. You moved through events in sequence. You answered questions as precisely as you could. You resisted the temptation to editorialize, because editorializing was how you introduced error, and error was how reports became unreliable, and unreliable reports were how policy got made on bad foundations. You told what happened. You let the analysis be someone else's problem. The problem was that this time, what had happened was categorically strange, and the protocol was designed for things that weren't categorically strange. The part of the report that generated the most attention was Section 7, subsection C. Unidentified asset call sign Pale Echo. The intelligence officer running the debrief, a major named Theodore Ashton, asked Cole to walk through the radio contact 3 times in sequence, each time asking slightly different questions, each time arriving at the same point and pausing. And she never identified her unit? No. Or her position? No. She gave you tactical information that proved accurate, coordinated your movement, and made 2 confirmed shots at ranges exceeding 900 meters. Cold bore, in conditions that significantly degrade accuracy at those distances. Yes. Ashton was quiet for a moment. He was a careful man, not cautious in a timid way, but careful in the way of someone who has learned that the difference between a careful statement and a careless one can be enormous. The call sign, he said, did it mean anything to any of you? Cole looked at Burkett, because it had meant something to Burkett. Not during the contact, when everything was noise and heat and movement, but in the vehicle afterward, somewhere around the 20-minute mark, when the adrenaline had finally metabolized and his brain had started processing things it had been deferring. Something had surfaced, a name, a context, a fragment of a story told in a different place and time. 4 years ago, Burkett said, I was at Bragg for a training cycle. One of the range officers mentioned in passing, not a briefing, just conversation, a female sniper who'd been cycled through evaluation, said she'd broken 3 of the standing range records in 2 days, and that the board had recommended she not proceed. Ashton's expression didn't change. Recommended against for what reason? He used the phrase outside operational parameters, which I understood at the time to mean she was too good, and they didn't know what to do with her. Burkett paused. He mentioned the call sign, said she'd chosen it herself. Pale Echo. He said it like it was a private joke she was having at everyone's expense, like she was already planning to be something they couldn't account for. The room was quiet. Ashton wrote something in his notes, slowly, like a man being very careful about what he was committing to paper. The call sign does not appear in current operational rosters, he said. I ran it before this debrief. I assumed it wouldn't. If she's operating independently without assignment, without authorization, then she saved 6 lives without authorization, Cole said. Which is the kind of problem I'm comfortable with. Ashton looked at him, not disapprovingly, just measuring. The concern, he said carefully, is not the outcome. The concern is that someone with that level of capability, operating outside any command structure, choosing their own targets, choosing their own engagements, also chose to pull a pin team out of a losing situation instead of watching them die. Yes. Ashton closed the folder. That's the part I find most interesting. 2 weeks later, in a different country, a different desert, Specialist Calvin Merritt had been told the rotation was straightforward. Resupply escort, known route, minimal threat assessment. He'd been told this by people who were working from intelligence that was 12 hours old in a situation that had changed significantly in the preceding 11. The convoy was 3 vehicles. 2 of the vehicles made it to the rally point. The third Merritt's developed a mechanical issue at a bend in the road that put it in a position that was, in retrospect, almost precisely the worst possible position it could occupy relative to the elevated terrain on both sides. The road curved through a shallow canyon with rock faces rising 30 to 40 meters on the east and a lower rubble ridge on the west. And when the engine coughed and died, and they rolled to a stop, The geometry of that canyon was such that there were, by Merritt's rapid estimate, 6 viable firing positions on the high ground and no dead ground to retreat into. It was the kind of position that, in a training environment, would be used as an example of what not to do. In the field, you ended up in it because the road went where it went and the engine stopped when it stopped. The 2 forward vehicles were gone before anyone registered the sound, not an explosion, just the mechanical problem announcing itself. The engine note dropping and the vehicle coasting to silence. Merritt had keyed his radio immediately and gotten acknowledgement. Help was coming. Help was also 12 to 14 minutes away on a road that, under current circumstances, felt like 12 to 14 years. The shooting started at the 4-minute mark. By the time the 2 forward vehicles made it back, it would all be over one way or another, and Merritt had understood that in the first 30 seconds with the clarity that crisis sometimes provides, stripping away everything except the essential question, which was, how do 5 people stay alive for the next 10 minutes in a position where the tactical advantage is entirely and completely not theirs? By the time the shooting started, the 2 forward vehicles were out of engagement range, and Merritt was pinned with 4 others behind the truck, taking fire from a bearing they couldn't identify with any precision because the echoes off the canyon walls were folding in on themselves and rendering direction meaningless. The radio had been working fine until it hadn't. And then, just as Merritt had finished calculating that they had approximately the same probability of surviving a run for the ridgeline as they did staying behind the truck, which was to say, not good, but the ridgeline at least offered action rather than passivity, a different voice came through on a frequency that wasn't in their operational brief. 4 of you can move, 1 can't. Separate the 1 who can't from the 3, get him behind the front axle. It's the only angle that gives him coverage on all vectors. Merritt looked at his team. Looked at PFC Raymond Dole, whose left leg had taken a round in the first burst and who was propped against the rear tire bleeding steadily. Do it now. You have about 40 seconds before the shooter repositions and you lose the geometry. Who is this? Merritt demanded. Someone who can see what you can't. 40 seconds is now 38. They moved Dole. It took both of the remaining able-bodied men, and it was awkward and painful, and Dole made sounds that would stay with Merritt for a long time, but they got him behind the front axle, and 2 seconds later a round hit exactly where his head had been. Good. Now, listen carefully. There are 2 firing positions active. The one giving you trouble is mobile. He's been moving every 6 to 8 minutes along the east ridge. The second is stationary, south-facing, and hasn't fired yet because he's there for when you run. I'm going to take the stationary one first. When I do, you'll hear it. The mobile one will pause not long, maybe 5 seconds, and when he does, you run northwest. There's a culvert at 40 meters. Get Dole there and stay low. What about you? When you're in the culvert, I'll take the mobile. That's Merritt stopped. That's 2 shots at different distances with a repositioning in between while we're in the open. Yes. In how much time? Less than 60 seconds. Ideally. Merritt processed this. That's not. I'm aware of what it is. Are you ready? He looked at his team. He looked at Dole, whose face was tight and white and who was nodding slightly, which was the most courage Merritt had ever seen compressed into a single gesture. Ready, Merritt said. The shot came 30 seconds later. 1 clean report, very far south, and then silence, the deliberate silence of someone listening for the response. The response was a pause. 6 seconds. Maybe 7. Go, Merritt said. They went. The culvert was 42 meters, not 40, but close enough. They got Dole in low and flat, and Merritt pressed himself against the concrete and counted. 55 seconds after the first shot, the second one came a different direction, a longer distance, the sound of it arriving several full beats after the impact they couldn't see. And then the radio. You're clear. Help is 12 minutes out, on bearing 170. Wave them in. Pale echo, Merritt said. Static. Tell your people to stop getting themselves into situations that require rescuing. And then nothing. The third time her call sign appeared in an official report, it appeared with a range attached that caused 3 separate senior personnel to request that the report be verified before it was entered into the permanent record. The range was 3,847 meters. The conditions at time of shot: sustained wind 16 to 22 knots with variable gusts, ambient temperature 49 degrees Celsius, a heat shimmer that the reporting officer described as making the target zone visually unreliable at distances past 800 meters. The target had been in the process of transmitting targeting coordinates for a strike that would have killed between 30 and 40 people, civilian and military, in a compound 6 kilometers west. The target was using equipment sophisticated enough that it had evaded electronic interdiction for 4 days. The target was surrounded by terrain that made conventional approach impossible in the time available. The shot had happened 14 seconds before the targeting data completed transmission. 1 shot, cold bore, no confirming round, no second attempt. The analyst who wrote the verification report, a woman named Christine Holbrook, who had 15 years of experience in ballistic analysis and who was not given to dramatic language, wrote in her conclusion, "The documented conditions at the time of engagement represent, in this analyst assessment, the boundary of what is physically achievable with current small arms technology. The margin of tolerance for a successful shot at 3,847 847 meters under the recorded environmental variables is, conservatively estimated, less than 3 centimeters at point of impact. Achieving this with a cold bore round, a round fired from a barrel with no prior thermal equilibration, suggests either an extreme degree of computational capacity or a somatic sensitivity to ballistic variables that fall outside the standard model for human performance. She had then added, in different handwriting, smaller, at the bottom of the page, as if she'd written it after putting the report down and picking it up again. Or both. The report went into a folder. The folder went into a system. The system had a flag attached to it that Ashton had entered 6 weeks earlier, and when the flag triggered, Ashton read the report in his office alone, very carefully, 3 times. Then he made a call. The call was to an officer whose name does not appear in this account, who answered after 2 rings and listened to Ashton summarize the report without interruption. When Ashton finished, there was a silence. Then the officer said, "Is she working towards something specific? A pattern in the engagements?" Ashton looked at the map he'd been building over the past 6 weeks. A physical map, pins and string, old-fashioned by any standard but easier to see whole than a digital display. The pins represented every confirmed or probable Pale Echo engagement. The string connected them by time and geography. "I don't know," he said. "But she's not random. The selection of engagements, who she helps, when she helps, how she structures the exit, it's deliberate. She's choosing. Choosing what? I don't know that either." He looked at the map for a long moment. But she hasn't been wrong yet. Owen Burkett, 4 months after the desert compound, was in a bar in Fayetteville at an hour that was either very late or very early depending on your perspective, nursing a drink he didn't particularly want and thinking about a conversation he'd had that afternoon with a VA counselor who had used the phrase intrusive ideation about 3 times more than Burkett found comfortable. The counselor had been good at her job, precise, unpatronizing, asking questions that required genuine thought to answer. She'd asked him what it was that kept coming back, and he'd said the desert, because that was the easy answer, the correct but incomplete answer, the one that produced a nod and a note and a continuation of the conversation along familiar lines. He hadn't said what he actually meant, which was, not the desert generally, not the specific events, not the people who had died, but a question that the events had left behind, the way a stone thrown into water leaves rings that keep moving outward after the stone is gone. He wasn't haunted, exactly. That word implied something passive. What he had was more like a recurring problem, an image that kept presenting itself for resolution, a question his brain was once and how'd. One he had was brain kept asking in the absence of an answer, the way a tongue keeps returning to a missing tooth. Not the sound of Pruitt going down, not the 3 centimeters above Fenwick's head, not even the walk through the dead ground with his back feeling like a window. What his brain kept returning to was simpler than all of that. "I've been watching you for 2 hours. She had been out there the whole time, in the heat, in the positions, watching them make their decisions, watching the shooters track them, doing her own geometry and her own timing and her own assessment. For 2 hours, she had not intervened, not because she couldn't, but because the moment hadn't been right, the geometry hadn't been correct. The shot that needed to happen first wasn't available yet. For 2 hours, she had waited with the precision of someone who understood that the wrong intervention at the wrong time was worse than no intervention, that patience was not passivity but its own form of action. And then, when the moment was exactly right, she had spoken 2 words. "Don't move." He finished the drink he didn't want, and set the glass down and sat for a moment in the background noise of the bar, the pool game in the corner, the flat murmur of other people's conversations, the small ambient sounds of a life continuing to happen around him. What did it cost, he wondered, to hold still for 2 hours while people were dying and not dying around you, waiting for the precise moment? What did it cost to be that accurate about your own limits, to know not just what you could do but when doing it would actually help? What did it cost to carry that kind of knowledge, that kind of capability, alone and unauthorized and without the infrastructure of a unit or a command to distribute the weight of it? He didn't know. He thought about the call sign. Pale Echo, something that exists after the original sound has stopped, quieter, from a different direction, carrying the shape of the original but transformed by distance and surface and time. Not the thing itself, the residue of it, traveling further. He left enough on the bar for the drink, and the one he would have ordered next, put on his jacket, and went outside into the night. The last confirmed instance of the call sign appeared in a report from a reconnaissance element that had been operating in the same general theater for 17 days without contact. They had completed their mission, extracted without incident, and had been 40 minutes from the forward operating base when their vehicle had stopped at a fuel issue, and they had sat in the cooling desert evening while their mechanic worked. The team leader, a captain named William Parrish, had gotten out to stretch his legs and had walked 20 meters from the vehicle because 20 meters felt like a meaningless gesture toward the open space around them, the horizon in every direction clean and uncomplicated and violet in the early dusk. He had looked north. There was a figure on the ridge of a dune approximately 300 meters out, not moving, standing completely upright with no apparent concern for silhouette discipline, which was either stupidity or confidence, and given everything Parrish had heard about Pale Echo from the various debriefs that circulated through the community in the informal way that important things do, He was going to assume it was confidence. The figure didn't move for the full 7 minutes it took the mechanic to resolve the fuel issue. Parrish stood and watched, and the figure stood and watched him back, or appeared to. At 300 meters in fading light, he couldn't be certain of the direction of attention, only the fact of presence. When Parrish turned to get back in the vehicle, the radio on his vest turned to monitor frequency, not transmit. Produced a single burst of sound. "You're good. Drive safe." When he turned back, the ridge was empty. The sand showed no marks that matched a retreating footfall. The direction of the wind that evening was from the northwest, and whatever trail she might have left in the loose upper layer of sand was already filling in. Parrish wrote in his report, under observations, call sign Pale Echo, confirmed presence at grid reference, Redicted, 1847 local. No engagement, no request, no actionable intelligence. She appeared to be monitoring our position and determined no intervention was necessary. And then, in the comments field that was technically for administrative notes, she looked comfortable out there. Ashton had, by this point, built a model. It was incomplete, and he knew it was incomplete. The available data points were only the ones that had generated official reports, and he was reasonably certain that Pale Echo's actual operational footprint was significantly larger than what had been documented. People didn't always file reports. Situations resolved and the people in them moved on, and the detail that someone on a radio had given them a direction that saved their lives got folded into the general account of a successful operation, and the call sign didn't get written down because writing it down meant having to explain it, and explaining it meant opening a conversation that nobody had a clear framework for. He had spent a Sunday mapping it out by hand, which was the kind of thing you did when the digital display of data was accurate but insufficient, when what you needed wasn't precision but pattern. The large-scale shape that emerged when you stood back far enough from the individual points to see what they formed. The pins went in one by one. The string went between them in time order, not geography, so that the map showed a journey rather than a distribution. And the journey had a logic to it that he was still in the process of understanding, but that was increasingly legible. She wasn't drifting. She wasn't opportunistic in the way of someone covering ground and taking whatever situation arose. She was moving with intention, toward something, or toward a set of conditions, and the engagements along the way were not the point, but the evidence, proof of presence, proof of methodology, proof that whoever she was consistent. What the model showed was this: she operated in a specific type of situation. Not all crisis situations. She wasn't reactive in a broad sense, wasn't monitoring general traffic and responding to distress calls. The situation she appeared in had a particular shape, small elements, cut off, with a specific kind of threat that conventional response couldn't address in time. She had never, in any documented case, appeared in a situation where conventional support was available and adequate. She had never appeared where the presence of other capable assets would have made her contribution redundant, which meant she was watching, constantly, and making assessments, constantly, and choosing with a precision that wasn't just tactical but strategic, understanding not just what she could do but what was actually needed, where the gap was, where the specific application of her specific capability would change an outcome that nothing else could change. The model also showed something else. She had never, in any documented engagement, been seen, not clearly, not in a way that produced a description more detailed than silhouette and general size. The range figure in Christine Holbrook's report was verified by trajectory analysis. The shot had genuinely happened. The physics were real, but there was no observation of the shooter at any point during the engagement. She appeared in radio contact. She produced results. She left traces too small to track. A depression in sand, a single brass casing at a location that required half a day's walk to reach, and that, when Ashton had sent someone to verify it, was already half buried. He had a theory about the call sign that he had never committed to paper because he wasn't sure it was the kind of thing that should be in a document. An echo is what you hear when a sound has reflected off something solid and come back to you, changed. It's the same event, transformed by distance and surface. The pale part, the fading, the diminishment, the quality of something that has traveled so far from its origin that it barely registers. A pale echo is a sound that shouldn't still be audible, and is. He thought about what that meant as a self-description. He thought about a woman who had been evaluated and found to be outside operational parameters, which was a bureaucratic way of saying that the system didn't have a category for what she was or what she could do. And rather than become smaller to fit the category, she had simply stepped outside all categories and operated in the space where the categories didn't reach. The space, it turned out, where people needed her. He looked at the map. He looked at the pins and the string and the accumulation of documented moments. He thought about all the undocumented ones. He did not make the call he had been asked to make, the one that would have set in motion a process of location and retrieval and formal accountability. He had been sitting on that request for 6 weeks. Each week he found a new reason to defer it, and the reasons were getting thinner, which meant he was getting closer to having to acknowledge that there was one actual reason underneath all of them, that bringing her in would change what she was, that the thing she had become, the thing she had clearly chosen to become, with full understanding of what she was walking away from, only worked because she was outside the structure, unencumbered by the kind of authorization chains and operational constraints and accountability frameworks that were genuinely necessary for everyone else, but that would, applied to her, function as limiter rather than framework. She had been evaluated and found to be outside operational parameters. The system's response to that finding had been to exclude her. Her response to being excluded had been to build something better, not better in an institutional sense, but better in the fundamental sense of being more effective, more precisely targeted, more aligned with actual outcomes rather than procedural correctness. She operated where she was needed, when she was needed, in the way that was actually needed, without the delay of authorization and the friction of command structures designed for normal situations. The situations she appeared in were not normal situations. He filed his own report instead. Under recommendations, he wrote, "Asset continues to perform with measurable positive impact on operational outcomes in high-value scenarios. Formal integration not currently recommended. Current status. Appropriate." He closed the folder. Outside his window, late afternoon was moving toward evening, and the sky in the west was the color of old bronze, and somewhere in a desert that was farther away than it felt, a woman was lying very still on a slope of sand, watching a horizon that hadn't resolved into anything requiring her attention yet, with the patience of someone who understood that waiting was its own kind of precision, and that the right moment, when it came, would be unmistakable. She had water for 4 days. She had ammunition for considerably longer than that. She was, by any measure that mattered, exactly where she wanted to be. The last record in the file is not a report. It's a transcript of a radio exchange that was captured by a monitoring station on a frequency that shouldn't have been carrying traffic at all, an obsolete band, theoretically decommissioned, that someone had apparently decided was useful precisely because nobody was monitoring it anymore. The exchange is brief. An unknown male voice, identified only as belonging to the element Ashton had flagged as the next probable contact scenario, said, "We've been told we might hear from you." A pause. Then you've been told more than most. Are you going to help us? A longer pause. The kind that, if you're experienced with radio, you learn to read not hesitation, but assessment, the silence of someone looking at something you can't see and deciding what it means. Then, "You'll know if you need me." And then the frequency went clean and empty. The way a desert goes quiet after something has moved through it, carrying nothing forward but the impression of its passing, the faint, lingering shape of a sound that has already traveled further than it should have, and is still, somehow, not quite gone.